Have you ever faced a situation where your authority was challenged unexpectedly? Imagine walking into a place where you are supposed to hold power, only to find someone questioning your very right to be there. How would you feel? Would you be shocked, angry, or embarrassed? What if that moment was captured in front of an audience that includes your peers, your community, and perhaps even the nation? Today, we dive into a dramatic encounter that shook the very foundation of respect and authority in a courtroom. This is a story not just about a black judge being blocked from entering court by a white officer, but about the lessons learned in the heat of the moment. Why did this incident happen? What were the underlying tensions that led to such an unexpected confrontation? As we explore this incident, you'll learn about the judge's incredible background and the hard work that led him to his position. You'll discover lesser-known facts about the historical context of race and authority in America. What does it mean to be an authority figure in today's society? By the end of this video, you'll not only grasp the complexity of the situation, but also reflect on the broader implications of respect and bias in our justice system. How can we bridge the gaps that still exist? Why should this story matter to you? Stay with us as we unfold this gripping tale, where one moment of conflict leads to profound realizations and lessons that resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. This isn't just about a single incident. It's a call to reflect on how we treat each other in moments of tension and authority. So, are you ready to join us on this journey? Together, we'll uncover the layers of this powerful encounter and the truths that lie beneath the surface. Let's get started. In the heart of the bustling city, the courthouse stood tall, a symbol of justice and authority. Its imposing stone facade had witnessed countless cases, from the mundane to the monumental. On this particular day, however, the atmosphere crackled with an unusual tension, a sense that something significant was about to unfold. As the morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the grand hall, the hustle and bustle of lawyers, defendants, and clerks filled the air. The echo of footsteps reverberated off the marble floors, punctuated by the hushed whispers of attorneys discussing strategies. Everyone was on edge, sensing that the day's events would be more than just routine proceedings. Then, walking through the doors was Judge Elijah Bennett, a respected figure known for his fairness and commitment to justice. With over 20 years on the bench, he had earned a reputation not just for his legal acumen, but also for his unwavering integrity. Judge Bennett was a trailblazer, a black judge in a predominantly white judicial system. He had fought hard to reach his position, breaking barriers that many thought were insurmountable. On this day, Judge Bennett was ready to preside over a highly publicized trial involving issues of police misconduct. The case had drawn widespread attention, and the courtroom was packed with media, activists, and community members. Everyone was eager to see how this trial would unfold under Judge Bennett's leadership. As he walked through the corridor, the judge exchanged nods with fellow officers of the court. There was a certain pride in his demeanor, a man who had made it through the storms of prejudice and bias to claim his rightful place in the judicial system. He was not just a judge. He was a beacon of hope for many in the community who felt marginalized and unheard. Yet, on that day, there was an undercurrent of tension that few could ignore. As Judge Bennett approached the entrance to the courtroom, he felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over him. This was his domain, where he made decisions that could change lives. He had prepared meticulously, reviewed case files late into the night, and consulted with colleagues to ensure that justice would be served. But as he reached for the door, everything changed. Suddenly, a white officer, Officer Thomas, stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The officer's uniform seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights, but his demeanor was anything but welcoming. With arms crossed and a stern expression, Officer Thomas asserted himself in a way that sent shockwaves through the judge's mind. "Excuse me, sir, you cannot enter," the officer declared, his voice firm and unyielding. The moment hung in the air like a heavy fog. Time seemed to slow down as Judge Bennett processed what was happening. He was taken aback, momentarily speechless. How could this officer, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, dare to question his authority? This was not just an infringement on his personal space. It was an affront to everything he stood for. "Excuse me," Judge Bennett finally managed to say, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. He was a judge, a figure of authority in this very building. And yet here he was, being challenged by a subordinate officer. It felt surreal. "Sir, I'm afraid you cannot go in. There's a protocol to follow," Officer Thomas replied, his tone suggesting that he was not about to back down. As murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, Judge Bennett could feel the eyes of onlookers burning into him. Some were curious, others were sympathetic, but the most disconcerting feeling was that of humiliation. He was a man of law, and here he stood, challenged in a public space, questioning his very right to be there. In that split second, he realized the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about him. It was about the perception of authority, about race, and about the systemic issues that plagued the justice system. What was meant to be a day of legal proceedings was now transformed into a public spectacle that would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. As he glanced around, he saw the faces of his colleagues, a mixture of shock and concern. Would they stand by him? Would they see this as an attack on the institution they served? Or would they remain silent, complicit in a system that too often allowed such disrespect to fester? The officer's refusal to let him pass struck a nerve deep within Judge Bennett. It echoed years of struggle against racial bias and discrimination. This moment brought to the surface all the memories of the obstacles he had faced on his journey to the bench. Nights spent studying while others played, the doubts cast upon his abilities by those who questioned whether a black man could be a judge. For a heartbeat, doubt flickered in his mind. Was this officer acting on his own accord, or was he a pawn in a larger game? Perhaps it was a reflection of the community's divided views on race and authority, a microcosm of a society still grappling with its past. Judge Bennett took a deep breath, summoning all the strength he could muster. "I am Judge Elijah Bennett," he declared, his voice rising above the low murmur of the crowd. "I have every right to enter this courtroom. I am here to preside over the trial." But Officer Thomas held his ground, an impenetrable wall of authority. "I understand, Your Honor, but we have procedures in place. You need to show your identification first." The judge's heart raced. This was a common procedure, yet the implications were anything but ordinary. This was more than just a question of protocol. It was a question of respect and recognition. In that moment, Judge Bennett was not just fighting for himself, but for all those who felt marginalized by a system that was supposed to protect them. As tension escalated, Judge Bennett felt the weight of every gaze upon him, the scrutiny from those who looked up to him, who believed in him as a symbol of justice. What would happen if he let this moment define him? What message would it send to those who had fought so hard for equality? "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice steady now, infused with a calm authority that demanded respect. "I will not be reduced to this. We can handle this with dignity, but I will not be treated as if I do not belong." The silence was deafening. It was a standoff that seemed to last an eternity. The officer's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had come to a halt. The air was thick with tension, and the stakes had never felt higher. As the crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move, Judge Bennett stood firm, ready to reclaim his dignity and the respect that had been challenged. In that moment, he knew he was not just standing for himself, but for every individual who had ever faced injustice and bias. The outcome of this confrontation would ripple through the courthouse and beyond, shaping the narrative of authority and respect in a world that desperately needed to learn from its past. As Judge Elijah Bennett stood before the courthouse doors, a sense of purpose filled him. Today was not just any day. It was a day where justice would be served. He had prepared for this moment for weeks. The case he was about to preside over had garnered national attention, and people were eager to see how the trial would unfold under his leadership. But no one, least of all the judge himself, could have predicted the encounter that was about to transpire. The large wooden doors of the courthouse swung open, revealing the familiar surroundings. However, as Judge Bennett approached, an unexpected figure stepped into his path. Officer Thomas, a white officer with a rigid stance and an air of authority, blocked the entrance. This was not a typical interaction. It was a moment that would challenge the very essence of respect and authority in the judicial system. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Thomas said, his voice assertive, yet devoid of the customary respect one would expect in the presence of a judge. "You cannot enter the courtroom right now." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Judge Bennett paused, caught off guard. "What do you mean I cannot enter?" "I'm the presiding judge for today's trial," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. For a brief moment, the world around him faded. The bustle of lawyers, jurors, and spectators seemed distant as he processed what was happening. How could this officer, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, deny him entry into a space where he had every right to be? The injustice of the situation cut deep. Officer Thomas, with his arms crossed and an expression that hinted at determination, reiterated, "Sir, I'm afraid I need to see your identification first. There are procedures in place." The words felt like a slap in the face. Judge Bennett had never been asked to show ID to enter the courtroom. It was an unwritten rule that judges were recognized by their authority and the robes they wore. His robe, a symbol of justice and respect, now felt like a heavy burden, overshadowed by the officer's challenge. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their eyes darting between the two men. Whispers filled the air, a mix of confusion, concern, and disbelief. For those who knew Judge Bennett, it was hard to comprehend what they were witnessing. This was a man who had fought tooth and nail to earn his position, a judge who had weathered the storms of prejudice to make a difference in his community. Yet here he was, being blocked from doing his job. "Is this how we treat judges in our courthouse?" Judge Bennett's voice rose slightly, reflecting his frustration. He looked around at the faces watching, gauging their reactions. There were reporters, lawyers, and members of the community, each witnessing a moment that would become a part of local lore. The officer, unyielding, met the judge's gaze. "I'm just following the rules, Your Honor. You know how it is. We have protocols to ensure safety." But it was clear to Judge Bennett that this was not about safety. It was about respect. The officer's tone, his demeanor, it all spoke of an underlying current of bias that was hard to ignore. The historical weight of being a black man in a position of authority, in a system often fraught with racism, loomed over him like a shadow. Judge Bennett took a breath, attempting to ground himself amidst the chaos of emotions swirling within him. He felt a mix of anger, humiliation, and the ever-present determination to stand his ground. He thought of all those who had come before him, those who had paved the way for him to occupy this space. This was more than just a personal affront. It was a challenge to the very principles of justice he had dedicated his life to uphold. "Listen, officer," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "I understand there are rules, but I am the judge. I am here to ensure justice is served today. Blocking me from entering the courtroom not only undermines my authority, but also sends a dangerous message to everyone watching." At that moment, the crowd seemed to lean in, hanging on his words. Judge Bennett was not just speaking for himself. He was voicing the frustrations of countless individuals who felt marginalized and dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. The officer's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Perhaps he hadn't anticipated such a strong response. But he quickly regained his composure, firm in his stance. "I'm just doing my job, Your Honor. If you could just show me your identification, we can resolve this quickly." The judge's heart raced. He had a choice to make, to assert his authority further or to comply with what felt like an unreasonable request. He glanced around at the assembled crowd, sensing the weight of their expectations. He remembered his oath to uphold the law, to stand for justice, and to be a role model in his community. This moment could not define him. It had to be a stepping stone toward change. "I will not be reduced to this," he said, his voice calm yet powerful. I will not be subjected to this level of disrespect. I am here to preside over a trial, and I expect to be treated with the dignity that my position commands." The officer shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the tides might turn. The crowd around them held their breath, caught between the tension of the standoff. Would the officer back down, or would he stand firm in his authority, potentially escalating the situation further? "Sir, this isn't personal. I'm just following orders," Officer Thomas replied, but there was a hint of hesitation in his voice now, a realization that perhaps he was out of his depth. "Orders or not, I am the one who ensures that justice prevails in this courtroom," Judge Bennett countered, feeling the fire of righteousness within him. He was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every individual who had ever felt belittled or marginalized in a system designed to serve them. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Judge Bennett could see reporters scrambling for their phones, eager to capture the unfolding drama. This moment was becoming larger than life, a narrative that would echo in the community long after the dust settled. With every passing second, tension thickened in the air. The officer remained in position, but doubt had crept into his expression. Perhaps he began to see the broader implications of his actions. The realization that a simple procedure could escalate into a public confrontation weighed heavily on his shoulders. "Let's handle this like professionals," Judge Bennett proposed, striving to diffuse the situation while still asserting his authority. "I will not show you my identification, but I expect you to let me pass. We both know who I am, and I will not be disrespected in front of my community." The officer hesitated, his resolve wavering. It was as if the weight of the judge's words hung in the air, challenging not just his authority, but the very fabric of their roles within the courthouse. Suddenly, the audience's presence felt monumental, the stakes higher than either man had anticipated. "Just give me a moment," Officer Thomas finally replied, taking a step back as he reached for his radio. "I'll call it in. If you really are the judge, we'll get this sorted out." Judge Bennett nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with frustration. He had stood his ground, but the fact that it had come to this felt unjust. The officer's decision to call in a verification felt like an admission that this encounter was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a reflection of the biases that often marred interactions in the judicial system. As the officer spoke into the radio, Judge Bennett felt the weight of eyes upon him, the murmurs of the crowd swirling around him like an invisible storm. He was aware of the implications. This moment would be scrutinized, discussed, and dissected for days to come. It was a confrontation that transcended his personal dignity, reaching deep into the collective consciousness of a society grappling with issues of race and respect. The officer's radio crackled to life, the words incomprehensible yet filled with urgency. Judge Bennett stood firm, waiting for confirmation of his identity, all the while contemplating the significance of this moment. He felt the deep ache of history in his bones, the struggles of those who came before him echoing in the background. Would this incident spark change, or would it merely serve as another story to add to the annals of systemic injustice? He couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced similar challenges and were not afforded the same platform to voice their frustrations. As the minutes ticked by, a new wave of uncertainty washed over the scene. Would the officer receive confirmation of the judge's identity? Would he have the humility to accept the reality of the situation, or would pride and institutional bias prevail? The crowd, feeling the tension, began to exchange whispers, the suspense thickening the air. Judge Bennett was aware that he was not only on trial in the eyes of Officer Thomas, but also in the eyes of everyone who had gathered. The importance of this moment reached far beyond the courthouse. It symbolized the ongoing struggle for equality and respect. The atmosphere in the courthouse had shifted dramatically after the encounter between Judge Elijah Bennett and Officer Thomas. As the judge finally gained access to the courtroom, a mixture of relief and unease settled over him. He could still feel the weight of the crowd's stares, the murmurs that had rippled through the gathered spectators. They had witnessed a moment that was more than just an unfortunate incident. It was a profound statement on the ongoing struggles within the justice system, and it would not easily be forgotten. Once inside the courtroom, Judge Bennett took a deep breath. The room felt different, charged with an energy that was both empowering and daunting. Lawyers and jurors exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. What had just transpired outside was no ordinary misunderstanding. It was a manifestation of the racial tensions that still permeated their society, an unwelcome reminder of the biases that often lingered beneath the surface. The judge sat at his bench, his mind racing as he prepared to begin the proceedings. He was a man of conviction, driven by a sense of justice and fairness. But that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being scrutinized not only as a judge, but also as a black man in a position of authority. As he looked out at the courtroom, he wondered how many of those present had already formed opinions based on the earlier spectacle. As the trial began, the case at hand was one that demanded attention. It involved serious allegations of misconduct by a local police department, accusations that had stirred controversy in the community. The irony was not lost on Judge Bennett. He was tasked with overseeing the case that reflected the very issues he had just encountered. He felt the responsibility weighing heavily on his shoulders. As the proceedings unfolded, the atmosphere was tense. The attorneys presented their cases passionately, but the judge's mind often drifted back to the encounter outside. He couldn't ignore the fact that the officer's actions had not only challenged his authority, but had also sent shockwaves through the community. The people who had witnessed the confrontation would surely discuss it, dissecting every detail. Would they view him as a strong leader or as a victim? And how would that perception influence their faith in the justice system? Throughout the trial, Judge Bennett remained resolute, maintaining control over the courtroom. He made rulings with confidence, but the weight of the earlier incident lingered like a shadow. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone seemed aware of the underlying currents. Some jurors avoided his gaze, perhaps out of discomfort. Others appeared more engaged, their expressions reflecting a growing respect for the judge who had weathered the storm. As the day turned to evening, and the courtroom sessions concluded, Judge Bennett retreated to his chambers. The quiet of the room enveloped him, but it did little to soothe the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to process the day's events. He thought of the crowd that had gathered outside, their eyes filled with a mix of emotions. He wondered if they would discuss the trial itself, or if they would be more focused on the drama that had unfolded before it even began. The following days brought a flurry of media attention. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a clash between authority and the legal system. Headlines blared, each article more sensational than the last. Judge blocked by officer, a shocking display of disrespect. Read one. Another claimed, racial tensions erupt in local courthouse. The day a judge was denied entry. Social media buzzed with discussions, opinions flying in all directions. Some praised Judge Bennett for standing his ground, while others criticized the officer's actions, pointing out the clear bias at play. As the media storm raged, Judge Bennett found himself at the center of a narrative that was beyond his control. His story became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for equality and respect in the judicial system. It was both empowering and exhausting. He was reminded of the responsibility he bore, not just as a judge, but as a black man in a predominantly white institution. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every word he spoke amplified. Meanwhile, in the community, conversations erupted. Coffee shops buzzed with debates about the incident, the trial, and what it meant for the future. Some people felt a sense of pride in how the judge had handled the confrontation, viewing it as a bold statement against systemic racism. Others, however, expressed skepticism about whether anything would truly change. Would the incident lead to meaningful discussions about race and authority, or would it simply fade into the background as another story in a long line of injustices? Among those discussing the incident was community activist Sarah Mitchell. She had long fought against the injustices prevalent in their local law enforcement and judicial systems. For her, The incident felt like a clarion call to action. She organized meetings to discuss how to address issues of race within the local court system and reached out to Judge Bennett, hoping to collaborate on initiatives that would promote awareness and understanding. Judge Bennett's experience is a reflection of what so many people face. Sarah spoke passionately at one of the community gatherings. It's not just about one officer's actions. It's about a culture that persists. We must come together to challenge this and advocate for change. Our judicial system needs to reflect the diversity of our community, not just in theory, but in practice. The discussions grew, with people from all walks of life coming together to share their experiences and ideas. Some recalled their own encounters with law enforcement, instances where they felt their authority was challenged or dismissed. These stories fueled a collective determination to push for change. The incident had sparked a fire that had been simmering for too long. In the following weeks, a wave of activism swept through the community. People began to engage in conversations about race, authority, and respect. Community meetings were held, where residents discussed how they could better support one another and demand accountability from their local government. They organized forums, inviting local leaders, police officers, and community members to engage in dialogue. Judge Bennett was invited to speak, and he accepted, knowing the importance of sharing his experience and insights. As he addressed the crowd, Judge Bennett shared the story of the confrontation, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident," he began. "It's a reflection of a larger issue that has persisted for generations. We must confront these biases and work together to create a system where respect and equality are upheld for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin." The crowd listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others visibly moved by his words. Judge Bennett spoke about the importance of understanding one another's experiences and fostering an environment where everyone felt valued. "We must ensure that no one is ever blocked from their right to justice again," he emphasized. As he left the gathering, he felt a sense of purpose rekindled within him. The aftermath of that day had stirred a movement, and he was determined to play a role in the change that was beginning to unfold. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but with each conversation and each story shared, they were chipping away at the walls that had long divided them. In the courtroom, the trials continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The awareness that had been ignited by the incident lingered. Judge Bennett approached each case with renewed vigor, aware of the eyes that were now watching him closely. He felt a sense of responsibility to set an example, to embody the change he wished to see in the system. Each ruling he made was a chance to demonstrate fairness and justice, a reminder that the law should serve all people equally. The media coverage continued, but it evolved from sensationalism to more in-depth discussions about the judicial system's flaws. Reports highlighted community efforts to address these issues, shining a light on the dialogues that were taking place in the wake of the incident. Judge Bennett's name became synonymous with hope for some, a symbol of resilience and the possibility of reform. However, challenges remained. Not everyone in the community was on board with the changes being proposed. Some were resistant, clinging to outdated beliefs about authority and race. Judge Bennett and Sarah Mitchell faced pushback, encountering individuals who questioned their motives. Yet they pressed on, undeterred by the skepticism. As the community moved forward, they began to explore ways to create a more equitable system. Initiatives were proposed to ensure diverse representation within the judicial system. They called for training programs for law enforcement to address implicit biases and foster better relationships with the communities they served. These discussions were not without conflict, as differing opinions clashed, but the commitment to engage in dialogue remained strong. The incident had catalyzed a movement, and as months passed, the ripples of change began to be felt. Judge Bennett continued to speak out, advocating for reforms and using his platform to highlight the need for justice to be accessible to all. He reflected on the day when he was blocked from entering the courtroom, recognizing that it had become a pivotal moment, not just in his life, but in the lives of many in his community. As new cases entered his courtroom, the dynamics had shifted. People approached the bench with a newfound respect and awareness. Judge Bennett often sensed a change in the energy of the room, as jurors and attorneys understood the weight of their responsibilities. They were all part of a larger narrative, and every decision they made would echo far beyond the confines of the courtroom. The weeks following the incident outside the courthouse were a whirlwind of activity. Judge Elijah Bennett became not just a figure of authority, but also a beacon of hope for many in the community. The small, tight-knit town, often overshadowed by larger cities, had ignited with a fire of passion and determination. Conversations filled coffee shops, parks, and homes, and everyone seemed to feel the urge to engage, to speak, and to act. Sarah Mitchell, the community activist who had become a close ally to Judge Bennett, was at the forefront of these efforts. Her office was bustling with volunteers, each one eager to participate in the movement for change. They spent hours organizing community forums and outreach programs, eager to build bridges where there had once been walls. But even with all this enthusiasm, there was a sense of uncertainty in the air. Will this really lead to any change? One volunteer asked during a meeting, her voice tinged with doubt. What if we're just shouting into the void? Sarah looked around the room, sensing the mixed feelings. Every movement starts with a whisper, and sometimes those whispers grow into a roar. She replied, her voice steady. We have to believe in our voices and keep pushing forward. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen if we keep working together. The first community forum was scheduled at the local community center, a modest building that had hosted everything from birthday parties to town hall meetings. The excitement was palpable, but so was the tension. As the date approached, people began to wonder what to expect. Would the discussions be productive, or would they lead to arguments? On the evening of the forum, the community center was filled with a diverse crowd, buzzing with anticipation. Young and old, families and individuals, everyone was eager to express their thoughts and listen to one another. Judge Bennett arrived, and as he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. His presence commanded respect, and the tension in the room began to shift. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm but firm. What happened outside the courthouse was not just an incident. It was a reflection of deeper issues that have long plagued our community. We need to talk about these issues openly, without fear of judgment. This is our chance to create a dialogue that can lead to real change. He could see the audience's apprehension slowly fade. People were leaning in, eager to hear what he had to say. The first few questions were tentative, but as the discussions unfolded, the atmosphere began to crackle with energy. A woman raised her hand, her voice shaking slightly. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen the way our police department treats people differently based on their skin color. It's not right, and we need to change that." Nods of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Judge Bennett felt a surge of hope. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years was finally finding its voice. More people shared their stories, each one more powerful than the last. A young man spoke about his own run-ins with the police, how he had felt dehumanized and ignored. An elderly woman shared her fears for her grandchildren, living in a world where they could be judged solely by the color of their skin. As the night wore on, the discussions became more heated. While many voices chimed in for change, others pushed back, reluctant to accept that anything was wrong. "You have to understand," one older man said, his voice rising. "Not all police are bad. They're just doing their job. We can't blame them for everything." The room tensed again, and Sarah stepped in. "It's not about blaming individuals. It's about acknowledging a system that has allowed these injustices to happen for too long. We have to look at the bigger picture." Judge Bennett, sensing the rising tension, knew he had to act as a mediator. "This is the purpose of these discussions," he said, his voice steady. "We need to listen to one another, to understand the different perspectives that exist within our community. It's not easy, but it's necessary." As the night progressed, the conversations ebbed and flowed, sometimes heated, sometimes deeply reflective. People began to realize that they had more in common than they had thought. The shared goal of justice began to unite them. They were not just neighbors. They were fellow citizens who cared about their community's future. After the forum ended, people lingered, reluctant to leave. Some approached Judge Bennett, expressing their gratitude for his presence. "You have no idea how much it means to see someone like you in a position of power," a young woman said, her eyes shining with appreciation. "It gives us hope." Hope, that elusive word, echoed through the community in the days that followed. Inspired by the success of the forum, Sarah and the volunteers quickly began planning another one. They reached out to the police department, inviting officers to attend and engage in the dialogue. To their surprise, many officers accepted the invitation, eager to be part of the solution. However, not everyone was pleased with this development. Some residents expressed concerns about whether the police were truly willing to listen or if they were merely going through the motions. "We can't trust them," one man said during a planning meeting. "They've been part of the problem for so long. Why should we give them a platform?" The team debated this internally, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Judge Bennett intervened, reminding them that real change requires engagement from all sides. "We cannot build bridges if we refuse to talk to one another. If we shut them out, we may miss the chance to create understanding." The day of the next forum arrived, and the community center buzzed with anticipation. A palpable energy filled the room as Judge Bennett welcomed everyone. The police officers sat among the community members, some looking nervous, others determined to listen. The format was different this time. There were small breakout sessions where people could share their experiences more intimately. Judge Bennett floated between the groups, listening intently. As he moved from one conversation to another, he could feel the atmosphere shift from skepticism to cautious optimism. In one session, a police officer spoke up, sharing a personal story that surprised everyone. "When I joined the force, I wanted to make a difference," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I've seen things that make me question everything. I've seen my colleagues act in ways that hurt people, and it tears me apart. I want to be part of the solution." The room went silent, and then someone else shared their story. They spoke of their fears, of their experiences with police officers that had left them feeling powerless. The officer listened, his expression pained, and as the discussion continued, it became clear that both sides were beginning to understand each other. By the end of the evening, something remarkable had happened. The barriers that had divided them for so long started to dissolve. They ended the night with a collective agreement to continue these conversations, to hold each other accountable, and to work together for a better future. The following weeks saw a flurry of activity as community members and police officers collaborated on initiatives. They organized events to educate the community about their rights, provided training for police officers on implicit biases, and held workshops that brought people from different backgrounds together. However, not everything was smooth sailing. As news of these initiatives spread, tensions flared in other parts of the city. Activists faced backlash from those who felt threatened by the conversations about race and authority. Some accused the community leaders of being anti-police or trying to incite division. A heated protest erupted one Saturday morning, with individuals from opposing sides clashing in the streets. The police department was caught in the middle, struggling to maintain peace. Judge Bennett watched from a distance, a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. He could see both sides, the anger of the protesters and the anxiety of the officers. Realizing that this was a pivotal moment, Judge Bennett decided to intervene. He approached the scene, feeling the weight of his role as a judge and as a community leader. "We can't let this escalate," he said firmly, stepping between the two groups. "We need to talk, not fight. Violence won't solve anything." His presence commanded attention, and slowly the crowd quieted. He spoke passionately about the need for dialogue and understanding. "We're all part of this community, and we have to listen to each other. We can't keep tearing ourselves apart. Let's find common ground." Gradually, tensions eased, and the groups began to engage in conversations rather than shouts. It was messy and uncomfortable, but they were finally talking. Judge Bennett felt a glimmer of hope as he watched people share their stories, their fears, and their hopes. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. In the following months, the community continued to navigate the complex terrain of justice and equity. The relationship between law enforcement and residents was evolving, marked by moments of triumph and setbacks. Judge Bennett and Sarah Mitchell remained dedicated to their mission, tirelessly working to foster understanding and healing. As the seasons changed, so did the community. They organized events that celebrated diversity, highlighting the rich tapestry of cultures that made up their town. Festivals filled the streets with music, art, and food from around the world. These events became a way to bridge gaps, to bring people together in joy rather than fear.